Are we recording? Good. Good morning, everyone. All right. So we are on the last legs of the class. I guess after this week we get 3 more weeks.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, it's sort of good news, bad news. I don't know. On one hand, I'm going, damn, where'd the semester go? On the other hand, I'm like, shit, I'm ready to be done, you know? Yeah, I know. We'll stack some stuff on you.
Please don't.
Oh, a little bit, not much. So we're going to be covering some things that I think, on one hand, I would say, hopefully you'll never see these in your career. Weird-ass parasites. I don't know enough doctor stories to know how common people come in with various sorts of parasites. Worms. I'm not really want to know. But parasitology actually is a fascinating aspect of biology and disease. In that you don't have an infection per se in the same way. You got this guy setting up shop in you, and there are some interesting ways we can think about parasitism because the parasite and the host have to have a very delicate, negotiated relationship. So we have these different kinds of symbiotic relationships. And so this is, you can think of this as a chronic infection, I guess, as well. But mutualism is a kind of symbiosis in which the different members of the relationship benefit each other. So there are a lot of different kinds of examples of this kind of long-term relationship that is an interaction. So this really isn't parasitism as much as it is a symbiotic relationship. So clownfish and the sea anemone. The sea anemone is toxic, but the clownfish are not bothered by it. So if you remember in Finding Dory, here we are. There's Dad, there's Dory. This is right before Mom gets killed, sorry. And then the British would say lichen. Lichens. It is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an alga. And they are breaking down rocks and things. So another type of symbiosis is one that's called commensalism. And this is a little bit different game now because one member is benefiting and the other member just doesn't care. And so, if you've ever seen birds sitting on top of cows. So here's cattle egrets and water buffalo, and delightful cartoons can be made from this. But the bird is just hanging out on top of the cow. He's actually, maybe nibbling a little bit on the cow, some of the bugs and things. But in general, the cow just doesn't even care. Barnacles, they can hitch a ride on a whale. The whale doesn't particularly mind. And the barnacle gets a free ride. So this is a commensalism type symbiosis. But then we've got parasitism. And parasitism is where we have one member of the relationship is benefiting, but the other one is being knocked back a bit. Now, a good parasite is a dead parasite. Now, a good parasite is not going to kill his host. The whole idea is you're going to be taking nutrients, taking something from your host, but if you are too greedy and you kill them, you didn't do a very good job. So you really want to kind of keep up where you're not killing them too fast, but you are getting something out of it. And so here is an example of an ectoparasite. They're wasp larvae eating on a poor tobacco hornworm. That guy don't know what hit him. This is a dissection of heartworms in a dog. All right, so we got some definitions and things here that we can go over. But parasitism is a fascinating sort of disease system. So we've got a long-term chronic kind of infection thing. So it's not going to be too, over too fast. And the parasite is sucking nutrients, getting something out of this, and we're beginning to actually beat up the host. So it is not a commensalism or a mutualism. Generally, the parasites are going to be smaller than the host. Very often, they have real specialized life cycles, real specialized, specific infectious pathways. They often will reproduce a lot, and they are generally fairly simple organisms. So these are going to be things like protists or single-cell eukaryotic organisms. Helminths, these are all our various squishy worms, like different kinds of intestinal worms and things, tapeworms. Arthropods, things like little weevils and gnats and stuff that can be actually on your body and things like that. It's usually, this term is working on macroscopic, pretty large-scale organisms. That the parasite's small, the host is pretty big, but the definition can be used in a lot of different ways. Because a parasite is, in fact, doing something to the host, they are going to cause some kind of problem. Itching, loss of weight, lots of things. Generally, though, it is not lethal. So, some things that parasites are not. They really aren't predators. So, a predator is more of an acute thing, in which the predator is looking to maim and or kill its prey. The parasite really doesn't want that to happen. The parasite doesn't want to be bothering you so much that you take steps to get rid of it. So, the predators are typically really big guys, and they end up being able to hold on to these small guys. Very small hosts, probably like the tobacco hornworm, they can't really sustain the really large parasites because you suck them dry. They're fairly complex. They are not. Generally, they are single cells, but they are typically fairly simple organisms. So, again, the definition here is that they're not doing some harm. They're not a parasite. So, there are problems. So we have bacteria that are living on us and that are long-term residents, but they absolutely are not doing harm. And in terms of symbiotic relationships and commensalism and things like that, with us, other than pets, I'm not sure we could start putting things onto it. In terms of things you're carrying on your body, we've got stuff that is not doing you any harm at all, and then you might have some parasites and things. But I'm at a loss for trying to define what other kinds of commensal or mutual symbiotic organisms we have on us other than our bacterial flora. So the system is kind of evolving to where the host and parasite can get along. Mainly, this allows for the parasite to hang out longer, so it becomes less and less infectious or less deleterious. Parasites often begin to lose lots of different unnecessary body parts and things. And they end up often having really complicated life cycles that they actually have to pass through multiple organisms. Snails, for whatever reason, are a classic kind of intermediary in streams and things. So the parasites often will have a very specific host. So these are some classic kinds of parasitic organisms. We've got or these are the classes of organisms that we typically think of. Things like fungi, and Giardia, which is a common protist, microscopic single-celled organism that is, I found single-celled regardless, microscopic in that it's found in water, untreated water. It's transferred by the poop of little animals, and it gets into your intestines and causes giardiasis, and it is not all that pleasant. It's, gastrointestinal difficulties, i.e. diarrhea. You can pick it up on camping trips pretty easily if you're drinking untreated water. Often, if left untreated, it just sort of fades back, and you have a subclinical case where you probably are passing it on yourself. Let's see, here's some worms, helminths, schistosomes. Here's a tapeworm, trypanosomes that are other kinds of parasites. Some poor guy is losing his big toe to nail fungus. Delightful. So let's just go through some of these different organisms. Fungi, you may or may not know, these are eukaryotes. They have, they can be single cells like yeast, but very often they are multicellular like mushrooms, or all kinds of different fungi. They have a cell wall, but the cell wall is not like a plant cell wall or a bacterial cell wall. It's actually the same material that's found in a shrimp or a crab, if you can believe that. It is a carbohydrate polymer known as chitin. So it's not broken down in the same way that wood, cellulose, is broken down. And these are all heterotrophic, meaning that they're eating carbon-containing material. There are no photosynthetic guys. Some fungi, they actually can be what's known as a syncytium, where they have a single cell that's got a bunch of nuclei in them. And there's actually some very cool experimental models that can be done with these guys. Slime molds actually carry out cell division in a synchronous way, which is a pretty cool thing. A slime mold is one great big cell, and probably has a record for being the largest cell, because you can have a slime mold that is a single cell covering a plate, and it'll have thousands of nuclei in it. And when the cells or the nuclei undergo cell division, they all do it at the same time. It's a very cool choreography. So you may have heard about, or if you've ever seen a fairy ring of mushrooms. This is the result of these mycelia, that is, this white threads, typically looking like stuff, that's in the ground. And then they sprout up as fruiting bodies when they actually carry out sexual reproduction. And so, not to get too much in the weeds with it, but the typical fungal life cycle is such that the main thing you're seeing and the bulk of the fungus's life is spent as a haploid organism. And then spores will produce and fuse, but the cell itself is all egg and sperm, if you will. They fuse, you produce these spores that germinate and immediately go into meiosis. And now, again, we've got the haploid organism. And if you dig around in really rich soil, you'll see these white strands of mycelia in there. And here is our mature mushroom. They actually have some very cool cell biology to them as well. And there are all kinds of beneficial fungi. We have a little bit of yeast beasties here. Well, no, these are actually mushrooms, I guess. Yeah, button mushrooms. But yeast, obviously, are very beneficial. We've got things you may not think about that fungi are doing that are really important. A number of different drugs come from fungi. penicillin being one. The penicillium mold produces the antibiotic. Another thing that is really critical is that there are a whole range of fungi that interact with plants and what's known as a mycorrhiza or mycorrhizal interaction. And this is fungi that are actually interacting with the roots, and there are a whole host of plants that either won't grow or certainly won't thrive unless they have the correct mycorrhizal fungal interaction going on with them. And so, stuff like corn and soybeans, they've got some stuff, but there are some weird tropical organisms, a whole range of different things, like pecans, for instance, that only grow in very specific spots because they have to have the appropriate mycorrhizal interaction. One of the things you can do is transfer soil from where it was growing into this new spot and actually sort of infect it with the appropriate fungus. Fungi are also responsible for breaking down cellulose, because remember, they're made with chitin. Many fungi produce cellulase, enzyme that breaks down cellulose, and they're responsible for breaking down trees that fall in the woods. If it weren't for little fungal friends, old growth forest would be stacked, 100 feet high with dead trees. But the fungi are able to colonize on a tree and break it down. So we like fungi. Many, but not all. There are a whole range of harmful fungal diseases. Plants are particularly impacted by this. And so when you start talking about plant pathology, the diseases of plants, there are some bacterial diseases of plants. But by and large, the main thing you worry about with plants is a whole bunch of different fungi. And if you've ever grown plants and you start to see white spots, you start to get mold and mildew on your plants, this is all thanks to fungi. So there's things like rusts, which affect grain like wheat, potato blight, which is responsible for the potato famine and the translocation of hundreds of thousands of Irish folk to the U.S. Dutch elm disease, which has actually wiped out a whole species of tree in North America. There are fungi that colonize aquatic organisms, like the chytrid fungus. Kills frogs dead. And there are fungi that are attacking bats now. If you ever, that's been doing this for a while, there's like sooty nose disease or something like this. And if you go into Mammoth Cave, they are very careful about not having you touch certain things, and the bats themselves are starting to lose ground in terms of population because they have this fungus that gets into them and kind of like messing with their lungs. Mm-hmm. So there are other fungi that are, they're intoxicating. They are things that can either kill you through toxins or do some interesting things to you. So here's a couple of examples. We got a mushroom that you probably can find around here, the Amanita class of mushrooms. There's Amanita verna and Amanita verosa. The destroying angel, or the white death cap. There's also the muscarinic Amanita, known as Amanita muscaria, which is somewhat lethal, but also contains fairly significant psychotropic compounds. There is not a mushroom type, but just a general fungus known as ergot that is able to infect particularly rye. And ergot has, as one of its metabolic compounds, a compound perhaps you've heard of called lysergic acid, which is the initial compound used in creating LSD. It is the L in LSD. And there's a story, how true, I don't know, that a batch of Ergody rye was responsible for the Salem witch trials. It's an interesting story in that if you've ever played around with hallucinogens, perhaps you know, don't need to see a show of hands, but you can begin to have interesting sensory inputs. Start talking to things that aren't there, strange colors, laughing uproariously with no reason at all. You've been possessed by a witch. Yeah, it's an interesting story. Anyway, black mold is another fungus that is of concern. It can actually get into the lungs and cause all kinds of different kinds of problems. There are aflatoxins. These are fungi that grow on a range of different ground nuts, and they are deadly toxic. Peanut butter contains a small amount of aflatoxin, typically not enough to hurt anybody, but they actually do have to check for it. So that was fungi that were generating various kinds of intoxicating substances or lethal compounds. We then have some fungi that are more in line with kind of standard infection. Could even be occasionally mistaken for bacterial infection. So there are yeast, and they can colonize, particularly if you're immune compromised. In the mouth is one obvious place. You can also get yeast infections on other parts of your body, moist, dark spots. Oral candidiasis, also known as thrush, is a yeast infection. And this happens because the immune system is getting knocked back a bit and allows these things that are on our cell surface anyway to get a foothold. Nail fungus, I'm not sure how much of your immune response is going to be with this, as much as it is genetics, bad luck, poor hygiene, a variety of things. But you can end up with a range of different species on your skin. They begin to get into your nails. We probably all have, to a degree, a range of different fungi. And they can hang for years on you. So other dermal infections that perhaps you've heard of, like athlete's foot, which if you've ever had it, A, it can hang around for a very long time. B, you can't treat it all that fast. We don't have antibiotics in the same way. These are fungi. They are eukaryotes, just like you are a eukaryote. And while with bacteria, we can exploit the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes and generate antibiotics that work really, really well, with fungi, it is a whole different game because the difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote are really great, but this is a eukaryote. And so you don't have this opportunity to disrupt, say, their ribosome, because their ribosome is the same as our ribosome. And so trying to disrupt fungi is slower and not quite as effective. So a little bit athlete's foot. Maybe you have heard of or had ringworm, which is an unfortunate term because it is not a helmet. It is, in fact, a species of fungus. And so these are collectively known as dermatophytes, and we are covered with different dermatophytes. Generally, they're not going to be causing any problems, any issues. All right, so just in the same way that we can, kind of categorize the disease based on where they hit, we can do the same thing with the fungi. There are respiratory fungal diseases, and happily, these are pretty darn rare. So this is a soil yeast, and generally, unless you get exposed to a huge dose, a massive blast of this stuff, you're not going to be, you really can't pick it up. It's not all that easily picked up. But there are some soil yeasts that can do this. You can get coccidiosis from dust, another kind of fungus that is floating around, usually pretty mild. There is another condition known as histoplasmosis, which is typically from soil mold. If you've ever smelled, soil, there are some distinctive smells to it, and there is sort of like, that moldy smell of a slightly damp basement. That is some of the different kinds of fungi that are present there. There is pneumocystis, which is typically on us and not doing anything at all. But if you are immune compromised, it can be a real problem. Treating fungal diseases is not easy. And respiratory fungal diseases, man, that is a hard row to hoe. So, we will pick up on a few more disease bits and actually start getting into the immune system, our body's way of fighting off these things, later. All right, for now, we're going to call it toast. 25 minutes and 49 seconds. I'll wait for a moment to make it an even 26 minutes. No, I won't.